Okay, class, I'm going to go back a little bit in chapter 2 before I move on to chapter 3 and bring up a couple of other points that I think are important that I really want you to key in on when you're doing your reading. And that was in that first constitutional convention of 1787, before they got to the Great Compromise, which is why it was called the Great Compromise, was because you had two different plans. One was the Virginia plan, and then one was the New Jersey plan. In the Virginia plan, they was wanting a strong central government where they wanted to give more power to the legislature and executive and judiciary branches. The problem was that the three largest states at that time was Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Had they went with a Virginia plan, then that would have given them more representation. Remember, I said that one of the major issues with the that came out of the 1787 Constitutional Convention was representation, which was about people and power. Basically, it was really about power. The more people you would have on your side, then the more likely things would be voted for in your opinion. Okay. So you have the Virginia plan, and then you had what was known as the New Jersey plan. And the New Jersey plan was the opposite somewhat of the Virginia plan, in that it did want a strong government, but that it really wanted to be one house with representatives with representation from each state. So that was almost similar to what was already in the Articles of Confederation, which was a confusing bunch of information. So in order to move forward off of the main thing, that is how they came up with the Great Compromise, and that they realized that they needed to have representation that was based on size and population of the states, so that each state could have similar representation, which is how you get the Senate has two per state. Regardless of the size of the state, there's 2 senators per state, which gives us how many senators? 100, exactly. And then the next issue, of course, as I mentioned, was about slavery and whether or not the slaves could be counted for population purposes. And if so, then that would have given the South more representation, because they would have been able to count their slaves as part of the population. And so that is how they came up with the 3/5 compromise that stated that 3/5 of slaves would be counted as one. So I wanted to make sure that I covered that a little bit more in detail. And then after the first constitutional convention, there was another one that happened. And in that one is where we learn a little bit more about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and which, as I stated, the Federalists supported the Constitution and the Anti-Federalists did not support the Constitution. So I wanted to just make sure I really covered that. Okay. So now on to chapter 3, which is around federalism. Federalism is defined as the dividing power between two separate governments, national and then the subdivisional governments on an individual level. Why federalism? Why was it first initially chosen to be something that we needed to know a little bit more about? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. Federalism protects minorities from unjust majorities. It divides power between our national and local governments, which is important. It creates a power of competition, which I think is important. Large groups of leaders rather than just one. We're not a monarchy. We don't have a king. We have a president. Contrary to popular opinion, we have a president. We do not have a king. We're not ruled by anyone. We have laws that we abide by. Federalism should increase participation in the political process if all things are equal and things are done fairly. It allows states to try different policies that may fit their needs. So if pollution is not a problem in Texas, Texas wouldn't have as stringent of a policy on pollution as California. So it allows states the ability to address the needs that are most concerned to them. If I'm in middle America, I'm not as concerned about hurricanes as I am about tornadoes. Although with climate change, it's kind of all over the place. But normally, that's how you would think about things. So my disaster relief funding, if I'm in Kansas, is around tornado season. Whereas if I'm in Florida, it's around hurricane season. So it gives states the ability to have different policies that best meet their needs, okay? So that's why federalism. What did the Constitution provide? It provided a structure and a good, strong national government. We really do need a national government. We need a strong, functional national government, because you don't want all 50 states doing whatever it is they want to do. Because if I leave Texas and go to Oklahoma, do the laws apply? Is everything different there because I'm in another place? So the national government needed to have the power to tax. It needed to have a power to regulate our interstate commerce. Congress was decided to be able to carry out the laws necessary and proper. And I think we've missed some of that necessary and proper in this in the current administration under Trump, because our Congress hasn't been able to carry out laws. You have things that are passed in the House that never see the light of day in the Senate. And they had something called implied powers. Excuse me. States cannot interfere with the national government. States cannot make war, create an army, or coin money. So those were some of the things that came out of federalism. The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states or the people. Now, this is always a touchy one because of states' rights. It had, for people of color, black people specifically, the states' rights thing really kind of leaves a bitter taste because of the allegiance it had to slavery and what the southern states wanted to be able to continue to do even after the Civil War. So it reserves the power to the states in terms of, as you recall, when gay marriage was first some states acknowledged it right away and others never did until it was deemed to be constitutional. Same thing happened in the civil rights movement in terms of rights that were afforded. The Brown versus Board of Education of 1954 was a case where a little girl's parents sued the district for her to be able to go to school there and not have to go to another school. So you have that decision which said separate but equal is not constitutional. Things need to be separate and equal across the board. And so that's what the Brown versus Board of Education was all about. Well, you had some states that, although the law had changed and the Supreme Court had made a ruling, you had some states that did not want to see children like myself go to school with other children that didn't look like me. They didn't want black children and white children going to school together, even though the Supreme Court ruled that it could happen. So if you've ever seen a movie about integration of schools, The Little Rock Nine is one, Ruby Bridges is another. Any movie you've ever seen, you will probably have seen some law enforcement prohibiting the students from going into the school, allowing them to be abused and mistreated by the white students that didn't want them there either. So it wasn't just on a state level. Local people didn't want it to happen. And so that's why the 10th Amendment and states' rights doesn't always sit well with people of color, because it's had a adverse effect sometimes. It didn't always work out in our favor. So the state has concurrent power. That's where things work in tandem with what the national government is doing. And so what happened under that, as I just stated, you had white separatists, white supremacists, white nationalists was using the states' rights to deny equal opportunity to African Americans during that time. So over time, the federal system evolves from a state center to dual federalism, which was that the national and state government powers were separate. And so you have two designs. One is considered to be a layered cake, where in the layered cake is separate, right? You have your federal government, federal government, or local, state, federal. So it's a layered cake. That's considered dual federalism. In cooperative federalism, national economy created, it can be compared more to a marble cake. If you've ever seen a marble cake, it kind of swirls around and kind of everything is all connected in there together. That's what a cooperative federalism is. And then you have what is a centralized federalism, and that happened around 1964 to 1980, where the national government had vision and goals about how things would go, and then the state and local laws was responsible for making it happen. So they look at that as an upside down pineapple cake. Okay, so you have your layered cake, which is the 3 different levels, local, state, and federal. You have your marble cake, where everything is all connected and swirled in there together. And then you have the central federalized, the pineapple upside down cake, which is top down, that's the one. And then you have the representative federalism, where states maintain their constitutional role, and that's kind of almost pretty much where we are now. So there were several cases that, as I stated, that our federalism was challenged. You had the case of McCulloch versus Maryland of 1819 that had to do with banking and the paying of taxes. You had the Brown versus Board of Education of 1954, where the power of the states was used to segregate was ended by the national government. You have the state poll tax was found to be unconstitutional in 1966. The state poll tax is a tax that government was using on people to prohibit them from voting. If you could not afford to pay this tax, then you could not vote. So, which is why it's interesting with the changes that was made to the by the 2013 Holder versus Shelby ruling from the Supreme Court, people that are active in the community and active in voting felt like this new ID law that went into place in several states was similar to a poll tax, making it seem impossible for some people to get an ID, especially if they were elderly on a fixed income. They may have even been homeless. So making them have to have a certain type of ID, some looked at that as a poll tax. And so that is what that was, is that it really prevented you from voting if you couldn't afford to pay. If you ever saw the movie Selma, that scene where Oprah's character was going in to try to register to vote, and they asked her to name all of the county commissioners and everybody in the whole state of Alabama, right? Those sorts of things. They had to be able to count the number of jelly beans in a jar, how many bubbles was going to be in a bar of soap, in order just to be able to register to vote. So those are the types of things that people use, the states were using, local governments were using to prohibit people from participating in the process. So you had federal grants that were done, and they would supply state and local governments with money, establish minimum standards. They would equalize certain resources so that everybody had access. Types of grants, there was 4 different types of grants. You had a categorical formula grant. What was that? It set aside money for a specific purpose, whether that was school lunch, welfare, things that were specific to something happening. It had to be in that time. A block grant was used for education, social services, healthcare, and different things of that nature. And they were being sued by the states with to allow them to have more flexibility. Revenue sharing, that was something that was terminated back in 1987. And then you had project grants. A certain amount of money is put aside towards something specific, like the National Science Foundation, the National Organization of Trees or something. So if you were an organization and you submitted for this grant, then when you got the money, you could only use it for that. It couldn't be used for anything else. So that was a project grant. So what we know now as we talk about federalism is that it gave states some ideas to be more responsible. It gave us as citizens an opportunity to be involved in the process and to demand things to be equal and fair and equitable. But it also determined that the state and national governments, although they were separate, there were some things that they had to work and agree upon together. And so as we look at where we are as a nation today, how we should function and how we are functioning doesn't necessarily go together. And so as you are studying, I want you to think about how can our government function better based on what you know right now, on our Constitution, what was set out, what was said, who we are as a nation, as a democracy. What can we do right now to better function as a government?